Let's get started with this webinar today. It's 11 o'clock, as promised, we're starting on time. So welcome everyone to this webinar on corporate domiciliation to UAE, a webinar organized by JURISTAX in partnership with RAK ICC. So myself, I am Amira Haji Adam from Capkern, and I will be the moderator for this webinar today. We'll go through quickly the agenda items. So the first part will be on why structure in UAE, which will be covered by Dr. Samir Al-Ansari, the CEO of RAK ICC. The second part of the webinar will be on why redomicile to RAK ICC, and this part will be covered by Taruna Dulab, who is the Director of International Business at JURISTAX. And finally, at the end, we will take a few minutes to go through the Q&A, which will be answered by the Registrar of Companies in RAK. So a quick presentation on JURISTAX. JURISTAX is a group of companies with over 13 years of existence. They are a corporate service provider headquartered in Mauritius, providing a range of services such as incorporation of companies, accounting, fund administration, and bank account opening in Mauritius and in other jurisdictions. The group has over 2,000 clients over the world, including funds and family offices, and has a presence in Mauritius, in South Africa, Rwanda, UAE, and also has a Chinese desk to cater for the Chinese investors. The head of the international business at JURISTAX is Taruna Dulab. Welcome, Taruna. So Taruna is a corporate lawyer and compliance specialist in equal measure, and she heads the strategic arm of the group with the aim to expand the presence of JURISTAX globally. She's got many years working in global business so far, and she's worked for some legal firms in the past as well. And this has helped her to develop a firm grasp of the intricacies of the law and the complex global business landscape. So as mentioned, this webinar is being presented jointly with RAK ICC, which stands for Ras Al Khaimah International Corporate Centre. So RAK ICC is one of the fastest growing government-owned corporate registries with an excellent reputation for compliance and professional services. RAK ICC is responsible for the registration and incorporation of international business companies, as well as providing a full suite of registry services related to international business company activity. RAK ICC is a modern, world-class company registry operating in full compliance with international standards and best practices in the international business company formation industry. We are privileged today to be accompanied by the CEO, Dr. Samir Al-Ansari. Welcome, Dr. Al-Ansari, to this webinar. So Dr. Al-Ansari is a UK qualified chartered accountant with over 30 years of senior corporate, operational, private equity investing, board and strategic advisory experience. He sits on a number of boards, including RAK ICC, TVM Healthcare Partners, Rams Capital, and Eureka Capital. He sits also on a number of international boards, namely, he has sat on the board of the DIFC from 2004 to 2016. He sat on the board of Hokama, the Industrial Group, KSA, Dubai Holding, GIC, among others. And he's also a fellow of the ICAEW, the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, and is a member of the Institute's advisory board for MENA. So that's for the presentations. Just a couple of information before we get started. This webinar is being recorded and will be available over Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube very shortly after the webinar. Feel free to ask all your questions in the chat box. We'll be happy to answer some of them at the end of the presentation, or all of them if we have enough time. And for those who just joined us, welcome to this webinar on corporate domiciliation in UAE. Dr. Al-Ansari, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Amira, thank you so much for that excellent introduction. Delighted to join you today and to join the JURISTAX team. This is, what can I say? This is a very, very timely webinar on a very, very important subject. And I think the timing could not be better for Mauritius and for the rest of the world. Here comes the trickiest part of the webinar, which is sharing my presentation with you and hoping that all goes well. Let's see. Let me know if the full screen is there. Confirm that you see it. Perfect. All right. Right. So again, good morning, everyone. My task is quite easy. I think all the hard work is going to be Taruna's today. So I'll give you a brief introduction on the UAE and RAK ICC and why it is an ideal, if frankly, and of course I'm biased, why it's a perfect jurisdiction to re-domicile companies to, especially in the current environment. And so as a reminder for those of you that don't know the UAE very well, we're on the same time zone as you, so it's exactly the same time now as you have it in Mauritius. The UAE is truly a leading modern jurisdiction and offers users the options of using onshore, offshore, and free zone company solutions. It is a modern, vibrant economy. It's a real economy with a deep pool of human capital, resources, professionals, etc. And of course, all the things we all need to meet economic substance requirements, a key discussion point for many people in the current environment. We are lucky as RAK ICC to actually be based in the UAE, a modern corporate registry that provides offshore solutions in a jurisdiction, a white listed jurisdiction that ticks all of the boxes. I think we would all agree that there has been an undeniable shift towards more reputable jurisdictions, which are adhering to global standards. And this started a number of years ago, but has accelerated over the last few years. Pure offshore jurisdictions are increasingly under scrutiny, are increasingly being placed on blacklists and watch lists with inevitably serious reputational and operational consequences for clients. It really is a new world, and those that keep their head in the sand and ignore how the world is changing, especially when it comes to the offshore world, are only going to lose out because they will be left behind. Those advisors and their clients will end up losing out. And I really urge you to look around you and look for the best solutions. And this all changed a number of years ago. It's the Paradise Papers, it's the Panama Papers, you name it. These have all been game changers. And that gave then the EU, OECD, etc., the opportunity to act. Everything to do with tax, transparency, and so on really came out after these things happened. And then the introduction of BEPS, CRS, beneficial ownership regimes, economic substance, etc., all came out after these things happened and will continue to be top of the agenda and will continue to put immense pressure on those pure offshore centers. So what are you left with? What are the options? And typically, if you're a corporate or an individual looking to structure something, what are you looking for? Typically, it's stability, it's the right level of compliance of regulations, a jurisdiction that has the resources that will meet all of your requirements, the infrastructure, ease of access, travel, ease of doing business, a banking and mature banking and legal environment, and of course tax. And we can't, again, put our heads in the sand and say tax has nothing to do with this. Of course it does. It has a lot to do with this. So what are your options? And when you look at the screen, you think, well, you know, there are many options, whether they're global financial centers or top FDI destinations or top structuring centers, etc. But actually, it's not that simple. And we've tried to simplify it for you. You know, what are the cities or the countries that tick all these boxes, and those come up in a different color. And then we pulled it together to make it even easier. And you'll find that actually only 5 countries tick all of those boxes. And they happen to be Hong Kong, Singapore, the UAE, UK, and USA. But then when you drill deeper, are they really comparable? Are they actually equivalent, those 5 countries? Well, we know the challenges that Hong Kong has today and the uncertainties around Hong Kong today. And undoubtedly, for some requirements, Hong Kong is still the best solution. But for many others, they're not. If you look at Singapore, again, ticks a lot of boxes, but has taxation and is a very expensive place to do business. If you jump to the UK, well, they're still dealing with the aftermath of Brexit, a lot of uncertainty around Brexit, and the tax bill is only going to go up and up and up. So is it really comparable to the UAE? I don't think so. If you look at the USA, again, they're still dealing with the aftermath of Trump, who may well come back after 4 years with all the uncertainty that that has put forward. And again, the deficit in the US and the increasing tax bill is going to make it more and more difficult. So I humbly would say the UAE is your only option. And why is that? Well, to begin with, the UAE is not a pure offshore jurisdiction or a pure offshore economy. It is midshore. In fact, you could say it's onshore. Strategic location, we all know that. We are lucky. We happen to be in the middle of the world. So access from all over the world, just one direct flight and you're here. We have been on this flight to quality to raise the bar, to be highly compliant with international standards, reporting requirements, and so on. And that journey started a few years ago and definitely accelerated in the last couple of years. This is a country that's now 50 years old with a mature banking and legal system. It's a real economy. You know, the economy of the GDP is $40,000 per capita. That places it equivalent to many of the biggest countries in the world, biggest economies in the world. And that, of course, gives any investor or somebody looking to structure a vehicle for the long term comfort and security that it will be here for another 50 years at least. And as always, and very important for corporates, has always ranked very high in the ease of doing business and world government trust indices. Those who've been here would also tell you, they would know, I've been here 34 years, high quality of life, a safe, very safe place to live, do business, a diversified economy, a business-friendly economy, an abundant ecosystem of professionals, experts, offices, resources, everything you need to have a thriving business. And of course, the fact that we have all of those things and zero taxation, and I mean zero corporate tax, zero income tax, zero tax on dividends, zero inheritance tax, etc., etc. We have 5% VAT, but that is it. And the ability to repatriate capital and profits freely. Huge advantages when you think of everything else that the UAE actually offers. Add to that the fact that the UAE has access to a very broad range of UAE double tax treaty networks. And with all the advantages I just mentioned about the UAE, if you structure your business and base your business out of RAK, then your cost of doing business, cost of living, etc., is usually 40 to 50% lower than the rest of the UAE. Many huge advantages for being structured in the UAE. And of course, a simple reminder of where we are, and when the world is back to normal, it is only a few hours away with direct flights from every corner of the world. So let's focus a little bit on RAK ICC. And we know from what we've achieved in the last 10 years that we do have global appeal that I would say accelerated in the last couple of years. When a lot of registries, especially international and offshore registries, shrunk in the last year, we actually grew in 2020 and we continue to grow in 2021. That global appeal has brought shareholders, investors from all over the world, almost every country in the world. But interestingly enough, 50% of our UBOs, shareholders, etc., are pretty much regional and European. So India is #1, the UK is #2, and then you can see the rest. But global appeal that actually is beginning to expand now, as more and more people who've never heard of RAK ICC before are taking notice of the appeal of the UAE, and then are recognizing that this phenomenal jurisdiction called the UAE has a world-class offshore registry called RAK ICC. So that's beginning to grow our demand, and that's why we saw this uptick in 2020 that's continued into 2021. And I see that accelerating because of the re-domiciliation opportunity that we will talk about in a second. We've also built a global network of diversified registered agents, as we call them, who either come from the international corporate service providers world. So JURISTAX is one, Vistra, Trident, Sovereign, Intertrust, etc., and so on would be others. The international audit and accounting firms, international law firms, and almost every name that you can think of are registered agents of RAK ICC, and therefore drive business to RAK ICC. And we have added so many more in the last 18 months, as more have put they've put the UAE on top of their list as a world-class structuring jurisdiction, and have recognized that RAK ICC ticks all the boxes for them. And typically, I call it versatile because the uses of the IBC or RAK ICC solutions are very attractive to private individuals and international businesses. And whether that is for ownership of real estate, different types of assets, wealth management and succession planning, international tax planning, trade, corporate structures, holdco structures, and so on. We've had many uses of the RAK ICC structures, and that continues to grow as we introduce more solutions to the market. So why RAK ICC? And I won't take much more time because I really am very keen to see Taruna take you through the REDOM opportunities as much as possible. The RAK ICC solutions and corporate features are very similar to many other jurisdictions that you would be familiar with. And so whether that's 100% foreign ownership, one-day incorporation process, no restriction on number of shareholders, corporate directors are permitted, you don't need an office because you are operating outside of the UAE, we do not need attestation of corporate documents, no requirements to file accounts, no requirements for minimum capital, etc., etc. So these are typical features that you would see elsewhere. One of our biggest advantages is that we do apply common law regulations with access to the DIFC and ADJM courts. We have a variety of legal structures and different products available for different usages, as I've mentioned. REDOMs we will talk about in more detail in a minute. And some of the features we have that we have found to be extremely attractive is the ability to have different classes of shares and the ability to register share pledges. And of course, we've talked about, the UAE has more double taxation treaties than any other jurisdiction in the world. So why not take advantage of that? Of course, the ability to open bank accounts locally, internationally, and the fact that the US dollar is freely available and our local currency, the dirham, is pegged to the dollar. Very briefly on re-domiciliations. So as we've mentioned before, traditional pure offshore jurisdictions are increasingly under pressure, whether it's competition, regulatory issues, substance, reputation, and so on. And most of the advisors that we talk to and clients are actively looking for viable alternatives to those pure offshore centers. And it's increasingly for reputational reasons more than anything else. And of course, for some, it is the desperate need to meet economic substance requirements. So I'm going to leave it actually more to Taruna to talk about the reasons for REDOMs, why they're happening, where they're happening from, and why RAK ICC is an ideal location to re-domicile companies. We know what the landscape looks like, and it's gotten worse and worse, and more of the pure offshore jurisdictions are on the UAE blacklist of non-cooperative jurisdictions for tax purposes, etc., etc. The UAE remains a whitelisted jurisdiction with considerable advantages that I've just taken you through. And that is why we really believe we are perfectly placed to receive re-domiciliations from all over the world. It is happening. This is not theory. This is already happening. This is just a snapshot of what we've seen over the last 18 months. We have had re-domiciliations from everywhere, from Panama, from Mauritius, Marshall Islands, all the way to Seychelles and BVI. The most have come from the BVI. Well, the BVI has the most companies, so you would expect that to happen, but that is accelerating. And we've got a huge pipeline already of re-domiciliations that are coming to RAK ICC in the UAE for all the reasons that we've talked about. I'm going to skip this because I know Taruna will talk about it in more detail. For 2 minutes, I'm going to cover with you a couple of products that I think you would find very useful. Premium product is something we introduced probably a couple of years ago now, and we did that in anticipation of the changes that were coming, including economic substance requirements. And simply put, a premium product is two levels, a RAK ICC as the holdco, and RAKEZ, which is the free zone of Ras Al Khaimah, as a subsidiary, which is the opco. And that gives you many advantages because the holder of the holdco can be the director of the opco. You take advantages of the offshore features and the onshore features. You can have staff, you can have visas, you can have dual bank accounts. And of course, a visa means residence in the UAE, means a vaccine if you require it, and all sorts of other advantages, of course, that tick a lot of boxes for many corporates that are looking to structure something in the UAE, to take advantage of the UAE, and to then have access to do business in the UAE and outside the UAE, and become tax resident and therefore avail of all of these advantages. A simpler solution, because premium product meets all the requirements for economic substance requirements, is a branch solution where you don't need to create a subsidiary. The UAE branch becomes then the relevant activities are then applied as enough to meet the economic substance requirements. It's a more cost-effective solution, quicker solution, but also works very well from an economic substance point of view. So finally, a minute on foundations. We rolled out foundations just over a year ago. It's been extremely successful. We know we've done more foundations than ADGM since we've launched foundations. And foundations, simply put, is a corporate body created with a legal personality separate from its founders, with all the advantages that that would offer. And I'm sure you can think of many as I say that. Typically, this part of the world has not embraced trusts, because with a trust, you completely lose control. You give control to somebody else. And so we have found that many of the founders, owners of businesses and assets, prefer foundations because the foundation acts through its counsel to administer its assets and carry out its objectives. We have a whole webinar on foundations, so it'll be very difficult for me to take you through too much details, but this has been extremely attractive for a lot of Muslims in this part of the world who did not want to use trusts and who are looking for solutions. And so if you have any interest, please let us know and we will share more information with you on foundations. And with that, Amira, I am delighted to hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Al-Ansari, for this wonderful presentation. I would now like to invite Ms. Taruna Dulab to deliver on why re-domicile in UAE. Taruna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amira. Thank you, Dr. Samia. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. Before coming to the gist of today's webinar about RAK ICC and the different entities that can be easily set up there, I would like to take you through the core challenges being faced by the IFCs of the world today. So I just wait for the presentation to come on your screen. Eventually, there are a few IT issues, as you may have guessed when we started the presentation. So just allow us a few seconds so that you can see my slides when I'm going to take you through the challenges of the IFCs. In fact, one of the reasons why people would go towards financial centers is because they offer a business-friendly regulatory framework and a combination of both banking and non-banking services. So this is one of the reasons why people move up and are attracted towards financial centers. And hence, an international financial center, if Amira would move to the slide, which is titled, yes, the next one. Yes, so you will see that one of the, like I said, one of the reasons why they would go towards it because it offers stability, be it economic or political. It offers an experienced financial community, and there are good support services and regulatory climate which is favorable to the financial industry. However, certain IFCs may facilitate money laundering, tax evasion, or tax avoidance. And this implies harmful tax practices. If you will go to the next slide, you will see that, yes, so often IFCs are also criticized for adopting a too light tax regime, be it low tax rates or tax exemptions. Such tax incentives sometimes fail to be reconciled with the need for a substantial presence or economic presence in a financial center, in line with the OECD recommendations for BEPS to ensure that profits are taxed where economic activities generating the profits are performed and where value is created. Another challenge is money laundering and terrorist financing. This is intrinsically linked with the reputation of an IFC. In the event such types of illegal activities taking place in an IFC, the international image of that jurisdiction is tarnished. There is a risk of having investigations, sanctions, and blacklisting. All these affect the credibility of an IFC and eventually its demand for financial services and FDI. So you will see more and more global legal and regulatory institutions are being mandated to oversee and strengthen the adherence to those international norms to fight against illicit flows. And sometimes this may make things more cumbersome to certain investors wishing to go offshore. If you will move to the next slide. So like I was saying, certain IFCs may want to challenge certain types of robust or economic substance requirements that are being required by international organizations. And when they defy or challenge such type of substance requirements, they run the risk of being blacklisted or grey-listed as a non-cooperative country by European Union or Financial Action Task Force. Any country, any IFC, which is placed on blacklist or grey list cannot afford to continue remaining on that list, as there could be ramifications in general, and more specifically for the financial services and banking sector. Now, what are the impacts being on that blacklist or grey list? As you will know, the level of confidence of international investors in that jurisdiction would be jeopardized. It will also adversely affect the ease of doing business and the competitiveness of that particular IFC. And many other countries will become suspicious about genuine payments coming to or from that particular IFC. And this is dangerous. This will more undermine the reputation and integrity of that IFC. So if we move to the next slide, you will see that all these risks have an impact on the banking, operational, and business aspects of a client, of an investor. There will be need for more enhanced due diligence, which implies more lengthier process for them. And at a more macroeconomic level, many banks which are present in those IFCs are there to target the global business sector. And with the risk of being blacklisted if in case that particular jurisdiction is blacklisted, the banks may be forced to leave that jurisdiction, which could be a considerable setback for that IFC itself. If we move to the next slide, and we better not get started about the bad publicity. As Dr. Assamia has said, we have all heard about Panama Papers. The name of a country itself was so much in the limelight, and this is all because of adverse media all the damage that could be caused by such adverse media. So if we move to the next slide, you will see that this part of the presentation was more about the core challenges that are being faced by IFCs today. And in the next slide, we need to show something which is very much related. I'll just wait for it. Yes, so this was, yes, so in the next few slides, we'll do a comparative study of the United Arab Emirates, Seychelles, Guernsey, Hong Kong as IFCs. All of us know about traditional, long-dated IFCs, and they are United States, United Kingdom, Switzerland. But since then, international financial centers have been undergoing major changes. And the reasons behind those changes, first of all, is about the advances made in transmission of information, the liberalization of financial markets, and an increasingly diversified demand for financial services. These developments have led to a widening of horizons and the emergence of other geographical locations to cater for a proliferation of innovating financial products. Since then, many emerging IFCs, such as United Arab Emirates, Mauritius, Hong Kong, have been major contributors of FDI around the world. So let's have a look at those four IFCs, four emerging IFCs. In the next slide, you will see that we have done, yes, we have put it in a table, which is really comprehensive, I hope, for all of you. So you will see that the United Arab Emirates have positioned itself as a strong IFC due to its regulatory framework, its double taxation network, and eventually you will see also its commitment to abide to international organization demands towards greater transparency in terms of compliance. If we move to the next slide, you will also see in terms of its tax regime. And here, I'll let the figures and the percentage rates speak for themselves. So it's 0% corporate tax. There is no taxes on capital gains, no taxes on dividends or interest. And if we move to the next slide, you will see that here it relates to the different types of structures and entities that United Arab Emirates offer. In fact, those entities are tax-free, low-cost, low-maintenance, and flexible vehicles, which allow for foreign ownership. There is no need to have any local director. There is, which is one more thing which is important to note, is there is no public disclosure of information on ultimate beneficial owners. And if we move to the next slide, also you will see here, these are the highlights of a business-friendly environment, which Ras Al Khaimah ICC offers today, like I've said, in terms of taxes, foreign ownership, or the double taxation avoidance agreements. You will see there are 92. And of course, there is a legal framework and adherence to international requirements for combating all harmful tax practices. So with this, we complete this comparative study. And we will move to the next slide. You will see, okay, so this is the subject of the webinar itself. So today the laws are changing. We are living in a period of uncertainty. Many countries and IFCs are being forced to review their offshore mechanism. Over the past months, I have been getting requests about the need to move away, to transfer, to shift. All these means to redomicile. And now, what is redomiciliation? So yes, it is possible for you, if you have an entity in one particular jurisdiction, but you want to move that entity, that legal structure from one jurisdiction to another, it is possible. It is in fact a continuation of a legal personality that your entity was already having in that previous jurisdiction. And hence, it can maintain its banking and operational history. This is something very important for certain of our clients. And now the common reasons that I have been getting for redomiciliation is firstly, the reason that motivated the investors to go to one particular jurisdiction is no longer in existence. The legal regime that motivated them to move there does no longer exist. Or the reputation of that IFC is no longer the same when they first went to that jurisdiction. So these are the types of reasons that we are getting for moving from one particular jurisdiction to the other. If we move to the next slides, You will see as well, as Dr. Samia has said, the laws providing for RAK ICC and redomiciliation there are flexible and easy to apply. In fact, you just need to ensure that your company is not in liquidation process and is not in administration or receivership. If we move to the next slide. So yes, once we submit the application to the RAK ICC, which I'll go into further details in a while, a certificate of continuation will be given to your entity. And hence you will be able to continue operating with a flexible, simple, tax-free, low-cost corporate vehicle, which will allow you to hold assets and investments, to collect commissions or royalties, purchase property, and provide international consultancy services. And now, how many days does it take for you to complete the redomiciliation process? It normally takes 3 to 5 working days for you to get the certificate of continuation from RAK ICC. Thank you, Amira. So here are the documents that are being required by RAK ICC if you want to redomicile there. And this is being taken care by JURISTAX as a registered agent with RAK ICC. So the documents that need to be submitted are listed, and all of the templates will be provided. It's the registered agent consent letter. We'll need the pack of documents of the entity where it was set up previously. We will provide the continued RAK ICC memorandum and articles of association. If we continue to the next slide, you will see the list continues here. There is the director's resolution that is being required, the need for director's solvency statement, like I've said, of your entity must be solvent, it must not be in liquidation or administration. The consent from the registrar of the foreign registry also is important, and obviously the KYC documents. And all these process steps 1 to step 4 will be taken care by JURISTAX. So next slide, you will see here, these are the most common questions that we normally get when we are proceeding with a redomiciliation. So I'll take one by one here. What if the name of my company is already to be redomiciled already exists or is not permitted with RAK ICC? So here you have got 2 options. Either you proceed with a change of name before moving to RAK ICC, or you can always go ahead with a change of name after completion of the continuation. In terms of documentation that need to be notarized, so here this is one of the questions that I've been getting most, and let me just reassure you that in fact, for individual shareholders, the moment we'll need a notarized specimen signature is only when the signing of documents is not being witnessed by the registered agent. And we also need notarization for corporate resolution from corporate shareholder approving the transfer of redomiciliation to RAK ICC. In the next slide, we will see further FAQs. So this one is about, yes, if an activity is not permitted under RAK ICC, eventually this will need to be amended for you to be successfully redomiciled to RAK ICC. What is the period covered for fees that you're paying for this particular redomiciliation? So it is for 1-year fees, so you will be paying it on the anniversary date every year. The last question here is if there is no activity mentioned in the memorandum of articles of your company. Many countries of the world allow for a very much generic activity or object of company. So this we can eventually propose the most relevant business activity which is allowed by the RAK ICC for it to be included in the new pack of documents. So with this, I completed the time frame process regarding redomiciliation, but we'll be happy to take any questions you may have afterwards. So here about I'm going to take you through a practical illustration on redomiciliation. So let's take an example of a Chinese investor who wants to do business in Kenya. And China and Kenya does not have signed a DTA, but which is not yet in force, which means that if the Chinese investor wants to do business in Kenya, he will be subject to non-treaty tax rates. So he will normally look for an IFC to do business in Kenya. If he decides to go to Hong Kong as an IFC, unfortunately, Hong Kong and Kenya does not have a DTA, which will make the withholding tax on payment of dividends 15%. But the same scenario, in the next slide, you will see that the Chinese investor, instead of choosing Hong Kong, but decides to go through a RAK ICC premium product and of the United Arab Emirates to invest in Kenya. By the very fact that UAE has got a DTA with Kenya, there will be a reduced withholding tax that will be applicable on payments of dividends being made from the Kenyan company, which is 5% instead of 15% as you've seen in the previous slide. So I will also take you through a numerical example of an illustration given just before. So like I said, in Kenya, there will be obviously a corporate tax of 30% applicable on all the revenue and profits being generated there. But once the taxes are paid in Kenya and there is need to pay out dividends to the holding company doing business in Kenya, if the holding company is based in Hong Kong, Seychelles, or Guernsey, you will be subject to a withholding tax of 15% before that dividends can be remitted to that particular holding company in that IFC. But if that holding company is based in UAE, you will be subject to a reduced tax of only 5%, which means that more funds will be remitted to the holding company being based in UAE. And eventually, once the money reaches UAE, there is no withholding tax on dividends for same to be reached to the Chinese investor. So to sum up, choosing UAE is an interesting route for investment towards other countries based on their double taxation network. In fact, if you move to the next slide, so this is the analysis that I've just done, and I have taken you through the figures. Thank you, Amira. So this is, in fact, my last slide on the practical illustration. Like I've said, the advantage that UAE has is its ease of doing business, its flexibility, its network of double taxation avoidance agreements, the 0% tax rates, which are very interesting for investors, be it on incomes, dividends, and most importantly these days, its recognition by OECD as a compliant financial center and whitelisting by the European Union. So I thank you for your attention. I leave the floor to Amira because I know you would be having a lot of questions. So I let Amira take those questions and direct them to either me or Dr. Samir. I know there normally need to be the registrar of RAK ICC as well present. So feel free to ask us your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tarina, for giving us so much insights on the subject. We will now take a couple of questions in the Q&A box. So welcome to Mr. Alan Booger as well from the Registrar of RAK ICC. So we'll start with a question from Mr. Mahendra Gupta. Is it necessary to appoint a registered agent for foundation if I am a visa holder in UAE?
Yes, I can answer that. Yeah.
Yes.
Good morning, everybody. Very pleased to join you all. Yes, it is necessary to have a registered agent. That means that that person is responsible for meeting the AML financial crime aspects of monitoring for the central bank regulations. So very important to have a registered agent that's operating in the UAE. An individual that is in the UAE can't do that on behalf of the RAK ICC Foundation. It needs to be through the registered agents.
Thank you very much. We'll take a second question. Are there any substantial business activity or economic substance requirements?
So yes, again, happy to answer that. The economic substance requirements are the same as you would find in any of the zero tax jurisdictions. So it covers things like banking, insurance. It covers holding companies, but only those companies that have pure dividend income as their only purpose. And the registered agent that we've just talked about can actually meet the economic substance requirements on behalf of the vast majority of those companies. Distribution companies would be the other area. And it's important to remember that for economic substance, it's only when you're dealing purely with group companies that economic substance becomes an issue. Economic substance is a whole different webinar. We've done webinars on that topic as well. More than happy to answer any questions that anybody has on that. But yes, the regulations and the requirements are very similar to other jurisdictions. as Dr. Samir has made the point that we are in the UAE adopting those international standards.
I think I would only add that the requirements and the solutions depend on the activity, and we're happy to provide more details on that for anybody who's interested to know more. But for some, it's very light touch. For some, it's not required. For some, it's a little bit more. So
for the vast majority of RAK ICC companies don't have to meet economic substance requirements, but for those that do, there are solutions available. Yes.
Thank you very much. Can a company do global trading, which means import from a Dubai company and export to another country? As an example, RAK ICC buys goods for the export, for example, to Madagascar, and the payment is done via RAK company.
Yes, so that's where the premium product comes in, because if the company is trading in the UAE, the company will need to have licenses for the activities that it's undertaking in the UAE. And the RAKES company, free zone company, can arrange those licenses. If it's trading totally outside of the UAE, so for example, trading between China and Kenya, then a RAK ICC company can be the invoice company for that, and it only falls under economic substance if those two counterparties are connected as part of the same group. So that's the structure that needs to be looked at. But yeah, absolutely, it can be used for international trade. RAK ICC company can be used for international trade. A RAKES company is needed where there is UAE trade happening.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Another question, we'll go through some questions on foundation and trust. So can a beneficiary of a RAK ICC family foundation buy a property in Italy in his name under the foundation?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen examples of that. So it's definitely possible. What we can't do here is give advice on the requirements for the land registry in Italy. So you would need local advice. But from our point of view, you can own property anywhere in the world through a RAK ICC foundation. Of course, that will depend on the requirements of the land registries in the various jurisdictions. But from our perspective, there's absolutely no restriction.
Very good. So a question on the trust. The other advantages of foundations for the trust besides ownership and control?
I think it's just the legal certainty, the fact that you get an incorporation certificate or a registration certificate with a foundation that shows its existence. Most jurisdictions don't register trusts, some do, but generally speaking, it's hard to get a registration document for a trust. Of course, you get the trust deed, so there is evidence of the trust existence, but the fact that it's not been registered somewhere, I think people like the foundation because they can see the same type of documentation as you would see with a company, and it gives them more confidence in that arrangement versus the trust arrangement where it's a little less formal, albeit the trust deed is in place.
I can tell you from personal experience that the foundations are less expensive to maintain over the years.
Thank you very much. Some of our participants are wondering why the bank account openings are so complicated or so impossible for some in UAE. What would you advise to our participants?
I would say that's a myth. That's a myth, not reality. If you had 50 people in this room, half of them will tell you we have no problem whatsoever opening bank accounts of RAK ICC companies in the UAE. The other 25, you'll get some that say, oh, impossible. Some will say, we struggle, but eventually we get there. So to be honest with you, it almost entirely depends on who is behind the company, what is the activity, where do they reside, are they high risk? Track record is become very important, and experience in the structure that you are providing, and therefore the bank account that you are going to be using for that structure. And transparency, you know, some people still believe they don't need to give a lot of information and expect to open a bank account. But to add to that, I would say in practice today, I can tell you in the UAE, we have several onshore local banks that are opening accounts for RAK ICC companies. We've got international banks that are doing it. And you've got the new breed of digital banks that are, frankly, a lot more understanding and open to the idea of corporates, small corporates, offshore structures that are looking to open bank accounts, where they don't insist that somebody needs to fly in and sit in front of me and show me the documents and sign in front of me and do all of that. So all of that is changing rapidly. And I would say, in a better position today than at any time in the last 3 years with respect to opening bank accounts.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Ansari. A question to Taruna. What would be the tax implications in your illustration had the investor structured through Mauritius to go to Kenya?
So that's a very tricky question. Kenya and Mauritius have signed a DTA, but unfortunately it's not yet ratified, which makes that there will be a non-treaty tax rates being applicable. And this is the advantage that the UAE will have over Mauritius if ever the investor wants to go to Kenya. And like I've said, it's really depending on the DTAs that are being signed with each individual country. And Mauritius has about 47 DTAs with about, if I'm not wrong, 16 with African countries. And UAE has about 92 DTAs with about 7 with African countries. So you really need to pick and choose depending on which investing country you're going to know which structure would serve to your purpose.
And may I ask Taruna, if in that example a Mauritius structure is used, what kind of a Mauritius vehicle would they use?
So normally the most classic vehicle would be a global business company that will be used for that particular transaction, that particular scenario. And in Mauritius, there have been a few changes in the law which will insist on having a GBC for any non-Mauritian who wants to do business outside Mauritius. So it will be really a global business company that will suit that particular business activity that was in the slides.
Sure, okay.
Thank you very much. What about the place of controlling company for a RAK, if we redomicile in RAK? Where is the real seat of the company? Apparently, banks require this information. Maybe Mr. Alan Bugor or Dr. Samir Al-Ansari can answer this question.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the domicile of the company is definitely in RAK ICC. The control can be anywhere in the world, depending on the economic substance requirements. So obviously, if it's a company that has economic substance requirements, then the control needs to be within the UAE. In terms of the banks, they would be asking for the place of business and also the place of control. But so the legal registration of the company is obviously in RAK ICC. The control of the company is where the board meetings are taking place. And those are only really restricted by the activity of the company.
Thank you. So we'll take 1 or 2 last questions. Can RAK ICC company act as an investment advisor or manager to a DIFC fund or any foreign fund, or set up an umbrella fund to manage segregated funds?
So that is an area that needs close consideration in terms of the financial services activities of the company, because a RAK ICC cannot conduct financial services. So where there is an investment manager and that investment manager is being paid for their services, that would be outside of RAK ICC. RAK ICC can be the holding company for the investments, but the investment manager needs to be licensed for financial services, which is separate to RAK ICC.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Allen. We'll take 1 last question. Is it possible to accept nominee shareholders if a BVI company has it? So I suppose when we redomicile the company in RAK ICC? What about accepting nominee shareholders?
Yeah, nominee shareholders are acceptable, but the UAE has recently introduced new regulations on nominees to show that they need to be declared. And I think that's a sensible measure in terms of the international standards. So yes, you can have a nominee, but you have to declare who that nominee is on behalf of. And also, separate to the declaration of the nominee shareholder, we need to have the standard globally accepted UBO declaration as well. So the shareholder, if they're a nominee, might not be the ultimate beneficial owner of the company. That UBO needs to be declared. And it's a demonstration of the UAE meeting those international standards.
Thank you. So we're receiving a couple more questions. We still have a couple of minutes to go. So if you don't mind, I'll ask some questions. Is there any specific filing requirement to be made with respect to UBOs?
Yes, just answered that question. It is a requirement for the UBOs to be declared. And we require confirmation of the UBOs. We screen the UBOs in terms of knowing that they're real people, and we look for adverse information on the UBOs. So we meeting those international standards for being aware of our customers. We do full know your customer screening on the UBO, the shareholder, the director.
What's the percentage cutoff point, Alan?
So it's 25%, the standard 25% or more ownership of the company makes, or control of the company makes somebody a UBO.
Thank you so much. And a last one for the road. We spoke about bank account opening previously. Participant is asking, bank account for offshore companies is a challenge in UAE, as I said previously. Can RAK ICC associate with any banks so that the investors can be comfortable?
If I understood the question right, yes, absolutely. You can work with any bank. I mean, again, it depends on where activity is going to be conducted. That might influence which bank you want to approach, but there are no restrictions on the type of banks.
And the other thing I'd add to that is that we issue a banking guide to all of our registered agents. We keep it up to date. It provides the contact details of the bankers that understand RAK ICC, and we do everything we can to support the agents and the relationship with the banks for that. So if you've got any questions about which banks to approach, speak to JURISTAX, liaise with the business development manager who keeps that banking data up to date for you.
Indeed, that's what I was going to add on what Alan has just said. If ever we are opening bank accounts in UAE, normally RAK ICC is copied and the banks already are aware and they will facilitate that relationship with the bank because there is an agent from RAK ICC which is copied in almost all emails. So this reassures the bank in itself and the client.
We've got great pains to explain to the banks the measures that we take in terms of scrutinizing the clients that we onboard. That gives them more confidence in who they're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a very, very good point. And probably banking is a great point to end this on. We all know opening bank accounts for your typical offshore companies anywhere in the world, frankly, whether they're in Hong Kong or BVI or Cayman or Panama or Mauritius or anywhere, it is a struggle. And this is why we take it as our #1 priority. And from CEO to chairman, in fact, we're involved in facilitating this because we know that has been a challenge. And honestly speaking, I would say today we are in a far better position than the last 3 years. We are actively involved with banks as a registry, which doesn't happen often, but we do it because we know it is a critical success factor for us and for our clients. And that's helped a lot. So banks knowing what is our world-class level of compliance and so on is also giving them a comfort factor that we will not let in some bad eggs to spoil the whole basket. And so it's everybody's role. It's ours, it's the corporate service providers, the regulators and so on to make sure that that doesn't happen, because reputation is extremely important. And you can have thousands of good clients, but 1 or 2 bad ones that completely impact the reputation of the jurisdiction. So we're very, very focused on that, and very focused on working with the banks to make it easier for our clients. And as I say, there are many solutions now. We're very focused on this. We proactively work with the banks and with our agents to provide them with the information that will help them and their clients.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Ansari. So I just saw one question which could be beneficial for everyone. We all know the situation today with the exchange of information. How about the exchange of information of UBOs in RAK ICC?
So again, there's been developments in that at a federal level within the United Arab Emirates, that the United Arab Emirates is collecting the details of UBOs centrally. That information is held by the Ministry of Economy. It's not made public. The UAE has made a stated declaration that they respect the right to privacy in these matters. But of course, they will disclose the information with investigatory authorities from other jurisdictions. It's impossible to do business in the world these days meeting that international standard of exchange of information between companies to prevent crime, money laundering, and tax evasion. So, of course, we play our part in that by providing information to the central registry, but that information is not made available to the general public.
And I think the key point there is it is not automatic exchange. It is on a case-by-case basis when there is a direct request from an authority, a foreign authority, via the ministry that comes to us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So there are a couple more questions. We'll look at these questions. We'll answer them by email to those who requested these. And also some of you have requested the contact details. We'll share this with you as well after the webinar. So I would like to thank everyone for joining this webinar today. And I trust you found it very informative. The recording, as I said, will be sent to you in the coming days. And for any question you may have, we're going to share with the contact details as well. Please feel free to contact us. We will all be happy to help. And well, thank you again. And I wish you a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Pleasure to have joined you.
Thank you, Karina. Thank you, Dr. Samir. Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.